want to talk about today is the figure of the victim of trafficking, and I'm going to be specifically talking about sex sector. So this is one of the aspects linked to issues of human trafficking. And the contribution I want to make today is concerned specifically with how humanities can intervene in the contemporary debates around trafficking. And what space is there for feminist theory to make a stronger intervention than it has done so far. And this is a really important topic for me because I have started working on the issue of human trafficking in relation to the humanities when I arrived to Utrecht towards the end of the 90s. But then I have moved more and more and further from the humanities into Department of Politics and right now into Department of Management. So there is no better place than revisit some of my own work for the last 10, 15 years from the perspective of the humanities and the contribution that the humanities can make to the field. So work by feminist theorists and sex workers' rights activists has been crucial in challenging the figure of the victim of trafficking and in broadening the debate from matters of organized crime and violence against women to those of agency, rights, and labor. Given the rhetorical and discursive dominance of the notion of trafficking as modern slavery and the tendency of politicians and NGOs to speak for women, it is no surprise that the majority of critical engagement with the figure of the victim has taken place in relation to the material conditions of women's lives and work, and by foregrounding women's voices as sources of knowledge, of action, and of politics. To begin investigations from the lives of marginal and oppressed groups, their histories and struggles produces, as feminist standpoint theories have argued, a less distorted view of the social and political world and contributes to transform the dominant modes of research and knowledge. And yet, as someone who has been working on this topic since the late 90s and has participated both as a scholar and an activist in the efforts to show the inadequacy of the figure of the trafficked victim or of the sex slave, and replace that figure with that of migrant women as agents, workers, and claimants of rights, I have become increasingly skeptical about the analytical frameworks favored in such critical scholarly interventions. My doubts concern, in particular, the methodological and epistemological premises of this work, in that critical scholarship derives and builds its insight on the evidence-based case studies of women's migratory experiences and on the working and living conditions in the sex sector. It seems to me that the emphasis on the material conditions of women's lives and work has reinforced the victim-agent dualism and the juxtaposition of representation and reality. Instead of continuing to engage representation only marginally due to its being perceived as a mode through which mainstream image of trafficking is propagated and enforced, I want to argue here today for making representation a key area and intervention for analysis. What interests me in particular is the persistence of the figure of the victim. The figure that we have heard last night is the one who is deceived, who is coerced, who is deprived of freedom, and who is in total control of the third parties. It seems to me that representation here is key to understanding the historical, cultural, and political embeddedness of the figure of the victim. In order to identify how the figure of the victim operates and work it does in a European context, and that's the context I'm interested in, I suggest that the figure of the victim is not a free-floating one, but it's rather produced through specific codes and conventions. So what interests me is the ways in which representations are embedded within and produced through narrative tropes and discursive constructions about women's sexuality that are culturally and historically specific. As I said, I examined this in a European context in relation particularly to East and Western Europe. As I said before, the other point that I will try to make is that the emphasis placed on agency works to enforce the victim-agent binary and in turn diverts attention from how the two coexist. This, by extension, leaves unattended the questions of the way in which victims' and agents' positions are intertwined and of the extent to which the contradictions produced by this coexistence are key to the formation of women's subjectivities. In showing the limits of this binary framework, what I want to do is raise doubts about the extent to which the focus of agency can actually carry the weight of correcting and replacing the figure of the victim. Just to give you a bit of a background debate on agency in this specific field. The need to foreground agency emerged from a combination of factors. Politically, it responded to heightened prohibitionist presence in public policies aimed at criminalizing the sex industry on the basis that the industry is harmful and exploitative to women. Academically, it reacted to the tendency brought about by the prohibitionist perspective to reduce sex work to a matter of violence against women and thus to simplify both methodologically and analytically investigations of how sex work is organized and experienced. Broadly speaking, just to make a very quick summary, in the feminist debate, we got two positions. One position, the one by prohibitionists, sees, they're called also abolitionist feminists, see sex work as violence against women and objectification of women bodies and perceives prostitution as rape, and therefore there can be no debate whether of coerced or forced because it is necessarily always degrading and damaging to women. And therefore to discuss consent in relation to sex work is just impossible. This position is countered by the group that is called, the scholars and activists that are called sex work right activists, who see sex work as a work. It is not about the self, it is a service. What one buys, it's time. So therefore it's paid work and it's contractual, voluntary contractual exchange. In that sense, what they have focused on is that it is actually the lack of rights and protection for workers in the sex industry that causes exploitation and vulnerability. So much emphasis from this perspective has been on the struggle for the improvement of sex workers' working conditions and labor rights. Why this is important? This is important because this debate feeds into what we today know as the working definition of what human trafficking is. And that definition came into force in 2000 at the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime by the UN General Assembly adoption of the definition. In that occasion, the definition that is known as the Trafficking Protocol distinguishes trafficking and smuggling. And trafficking stands for involuntary and non-consensual processes where traffickers recruit and transport a person with a purpose of exploiting her or his labor at destination. Contrary to that, smuggling refers to a voluntary and consensual form of migration where a smuggler's role is restricted to facilitation of irregular movement of persons across borders. What is interesting is that the definition of trafficking adopted by the UN does not engage the issue of legitimacy of sex work and leaves this decision to national legislators. Importantly, while it mentions explicitly prostitution as a form of sexual exploitation, it also inserts it within the broader frame of other types of forced labor and services. Following this definition, following the trafficking protocol, scholarship has proliferated around these topics, and from different perspectives, and the one coming from critical insights have focused very much on the issues about the link between traffic and labor in an informal and unskilled sector, and it's linked to globalization and feminization of migration, and actually it's linked to the gendered and racialized codification of the global workforce. An array of scholars working on issues of migration, labor, and gender have put forward sharp critiques of the criminal justice analytical framework that relies on the conceptual differentiation between trafficking and smuggling and the identification of both with organized crime. Studies of how, where, and with whom women have undertaken their cross-border travel, whether they've had previous migratory experiences, and what prompted them to leave their countries of origin have all shown women's active role in planning and organizing their migration. These studies have also shown women's travel agency and revealed a complex set of aims and desires that prompt women to migrate, such as pursuit of financial independence, escape from domestic violence and abuse, and search for love and autonomy. A common concern among the scholars and activists is in a way in which a criminal justice perspective places responsibility for trafficking and exploitation on organized criminal networks, and in doing so hides the extent to which states' restrictive immigration, border, and visa policies have criminalized the mobility of certain groups of people and created conditions that foster vulnerability and exploitation of migrants. These concerns extend additionally to the notions of sexual slavery, which overlooks the complexity and interdependence of the factors that permit exploitation and neglects form of agency migrant women enact despite confinement imposed on their spatial mobility and social interactions due to third parties' control or residency and employment restrictions. In focusing on the material working and living arrangements, critical scholars have destabilized the very basis on which notions of trafficking and that of the victim are based, in bringing to the fore the agency women exercise, both with respect to planning and carrying out of their migratory projects and managing working conditions in the sex sector. Scholars have disputed the separation between voluntary and involuntary migration, and hence between smuggling and trafficking. They have further shown that coercion and force might also occur in voluntary and legally regulated migration, such as domestic, agriculture, and construction work. They have also questioned the extent to which it is useful to draw a stark line between trafficking and other forms of abuse and exploitation of migrant labor. Despite this array of work that has brought extremely interesting empirical studies, there is, as we all know, a continuous persistence of the figure of the victim. And in order to explore that and understand that persistence, I argue we need to look more into issues of representation and broaden the existing work on representation on these topics. So far, when it comes to issues of representations, Scholars have looked in their analysis of anti-trafficking campaigns and rhetoric of modern-day slavery that depicts women as kidnapped from their homes, coerced into migration, and then imprisoned into brothels, and have argued that such representation creates a false dichotomy between ideal and real victims, and that excludes those women who do not fit the narrow definition of the ideal victim. Other studies of media coverage, for example in Norway, have pointed to the objectification and sexualization of Nigerian women working in the sex sector. And studies of the stripping industry in the US have exposed the hyper-sexualization of the Black and Latina women and the racialized dimension of the discursive construction of sex work. Representation of prostitutes as prototypical female victims and traffickers as members of Russian mafia have been found to position the state as a protector and both victims and criminals as not belonging to our society. While these studies offer an important starting point of the ways in which representation foregrounds the figures of victims and criminals, in what follows, I suggest paying a more detailed attention to the gendered and sexualized categories that underpin the narrative structure of victimhood. I particularly draw from film and literary studies to illustrate the cultural codes upon which the figure of the victim rests and the reason why this figure continues to retain its discursive power. The tragic story of a woman sexually innocent and economically naive and whose life and dreams are smashed by the harsh realities of sexual slavery is a common narrative trope in both textual and visual accounts of trafficking. This narrative structure of the loss of innocence reproduces the early 20th century genre of the fallen woman, popular especially in the films of that period, as mapped by Leah Jacobs, those films were characterized by a strong cautionary tone and a warning about tragic fate that awaits young women who left home to follow an acting career she was interested in Hollywood, the later symbolized by the popular anxieties about sexual trespass. The history of the trope of the fallen woman stretches further back in time and can be found in the literary antecedents of the story that permeated 19th century popular culture such as opera, narrative painting, stage melodrama, and fiction in Britain, America, and Europe. The cautionary tone about leaving home and the loss of sexual innocence, typical of the fallen woman genre, reappears in the contemporary narrative of sex trafficking, as the latter warns women who wish to migrate that their migration is likely to lead into forced prostitution and slavery from which they will be unable to escape. In a number of anti-trafficking campaigns in Eastern Europe, this situation is conveyed through the visual metaphor of a doll, like of a puppet that is suspended by the hooks and cords, or of a toy that is packaged and displayed in a box. Feminist scholars working in fields of literature and art have suggested that the representation of women as dolls is a standard part of the patriarchal repertoire of Western culture, a type of culture text that is invoked time and time again in order to confine the threat of female subjectivity. The gravity of this situation is further signaled through the image of the inanimate woman's body, or explicit in the representation, especially anti-trafficking campaigns, or the implicit reference to death, which insinuate that death is the only possible way out of the situation of abuse and slavery. The implicitly proposed alternative is not to migrate, as home is depicted in the campaign as the safest, and the home is depicted as the safest option for young women. What is interesting is that this type of representation of home, as devoid of danger such as abuse, violence, and prostitution, reproduces traditional images of femininity that position women outside of the labor market and inside of the reproductive and private sphere. To take this further, I want to look at the work of Annette Kuhn on film and sexuality, where she shows that far from being attributes that naturally characterize victims, such as body sexuality, passivity, private sphere, and reproductive labor, are all codes that form a chain of signifiers that come together to create a specific meaning in representations. These signifiers are not attached to a female body randomly, and are at the very core of Western science and knowledge that assume a male subject who is constructed in opposition to its other. This mode, as we know, rests on a classic Western system of dualistic oppositions such as active and passive, culture and nature, reason and body, public and private, are organized according to the logic of difference, where the difference is always expressed in the terms of the negative. Therefore, the masculine and the feminine are hierarchically organized and therefore not interchangeable. Then it is perhaps of no surprise then the term trafficking is highly gendered insofar as men are structurally perceived and smuggled and women as trafficked. This raises issues about the ways in which cultural codes around sexuality and gender underpin the apparently neutral UN definitions and foreground the figure of the victim. The question of codification and semiotics then brings to the fore the extent to which women as victims is shored up in representations of sexuality and structurally reinforced through gender dualism. Importantly, however, the figure of the victim is not a universal and identical in all contexts. Rather, the complexity of the figure of the victim lies in her embeddedness in a specific culture and historical forms. In today's Europe, victims of trafficking are overwhelmingly identified as Eastern European. While it can certainly be argued that this is due to the fact that the majority of migrant women working in the sex sector in Western Europe are indeed from Eastern European and Balkan countries, I contend that the identification of Eastern European women with victims of sex trafficking is not simply a matter of numbers, but is rather deeply entrenched within the discursive construction of Eastern Europe and its peoples. Here I turn to historical studies of Larry Wolff on Eastern Europe, who argues that even though the political map between East and West Europe has changed following 1989, the idea of Eastern Europe persists. He says that while during the Renaissance the main distinction was between the South and North Europe, with the Enlightenment and the location of intellectual centers in Western Europe, the main axis of differentiation shifted to that of West versus East Europe. With the emerging of the term civilization in the 18th century, Wolff argues further, Western Europe appropriated for itself the notion of civilization, and through the work of what he calls intellectual artifice and cultural creation, invented Eastern Europe as its backward and barbaric other. For Wolff, this conceptual division still survives in public culture and mental maps, and it can be traced too, I argue, in the discursive construction of sex trafficking, where Eastern European women are seen as victims and Eastern European men as perpetrators of trafficking. The process of othering operates in this case through the opposition between people of East and also West Europe, whereby former societies are seen as more patriarchal and violent, and the other as more progressive and democratic. The portrayals of both victims and traffickers as Eastern European, and of women as victims of the patriarchal social relations in their countries of origin, places sex trafficking rhetoric firmly within East-West European representation framework, and highlights the ongoing discursive power and the social currency of meaning operating through it. The working of this hierarchical opposition can additionally be seen in the differentiation between voluntary and forced prostitution and the racialization of the two categories, whereby consensual prostitution is assumed to be performed by Western sex worker capable of self-determination, and situations of coerced prostitution are associated with passive and inexperienced migrant and third world women. As we can see, therefore, the figure of the victim of sex trafficking is already historically and culturally coded. It is precisely this codification that in contemporary European context poses the victims as Eastern European. The figure of the victim of sex trafficking, then, coded as female, passive, unfree, and object of violence, constricts women within a confining, Eastern European women within a confining and disabling order of representation. As Spivak has argued, the fact that the members of certain social groups are not considered subjects results in a lack of subject position from which to speak and restricts the imaginary via which alternative subjects positions may be articulated. So what I have tried to do so far is to show you how this figure of the victim is constructed through sexual, gender, and cultural codifications. But what interests me at the same time is how this construction, though well established, is far from stable and definite. Images, whether in terms of representation or self-representation, are productive of contradictions and traversed by ambivalence at both social and subjective level. And it is these contradictions that and tensions that I want to move to next. In his work on stereotypes, Richard Dyer shows that stereotypes as aesthetic and social contracts condense a large amount of complex contradictions into simple and easy to grasp images. Stereotypes are static in their fixity, is achieved through the organization of the plot around an implicit narrative pattern and identical plot function. In being organized around a static narrative pattern, stereotypes function as a mode of order and simplifying of complexity of social life and a way of preserving the boundary between social groupings, and especially in situations where difference between social categories might not be clearly discernible. I want to read you a quote here. The role of stereotypes is to make visible the invisible so that there is no danger of it creeping on us unaware, and to make fast, firm, and separate what in reality is fluid and much closer to the norm than the dominant value system cares to admit. These contradictions are particularly relevant for the figure of the victim of sex trafficking in the European context. The simplicity of the narrative pattern is most visible in the fact that the plot never varies. The deception is followed by coercion into prostitution. Subsequently, the plot moves into a tragedy of sexual slavery, which in turn is resolved through the rescue of the victim by the police, by the NGO, or a benevolent client. Importantly, while Eastern European women are likely to be white, and hence racially not immediately distinguishable from Western European women, it is precisely stereotyped separating function that draws the line between two groupings. The representation of Eastern European women as victims differentiates them from their European counterparts and signals the limited extent to which Eastern Europeans have progressed in their movement towards democracy and capacity for political participation. To return to Wolf, though, this differentiation is ambivalent and unstable, as it is grounded in what he calls the twofold construction of Eastern Europe as Europe, but not Europe. In that Eastern Europe has been defined in opposition to Western Europe as different from the Orient. The idea of Eastern Europe has evolved, Wolf argues further, as an intellectual project of demi-orientalization, located in the intermediary geographical and cultural space between Western Europe and the Orient. It is this ambivalent positioning as European and non-European at the same time that results, I suggest, in the Eastern European women's dual identification as both victims and agents. There is an instance that is relevant for the Netherlands in which this can be observed, and this is the so-called Yanni Case, when the Netherlands Secretary of State for Justice denied residence permits to 6 self-employed prostitutes from Poland and the Czech Republic. The position of the Dutch state was based in the argument that women were not autonomous workers since it was impossible to establish whether they migrated and worked in the sex industry in the Netherlands on their own free will. The decision was overruled in 2001 by the European Court of Justice, ECJ, that argued that the Netherlands was in breach of the rights of establishment under the European agreement that gives nationals of the accession countries, the new EU member states, the right to free movement and self-employment in the EU. It could certainly be argued, as some scholars have, that the trafficking rhetoric is used by the states, as in this case by the Netherlands, to enforce control over migrants' mobility and labor, and that this in turn results in the exclusion of sex workers from the protection of the law. However, I would like to suggest that the perspective of exclusion fails to observe the ambivalence and contradictions that are part of the process of the European enlargement and hence of the juridical and discursive redrawing of European space, peoples, and citizenship. As the example of ECJ ruling in the case of the free movement of workers show, the focus of victimhood overlooks the increased impact of market logic on commercially mediated sexual relations, as well as on the social and political life more broadly. In contemporary Europe, then, the transformations and uncertainties brought about the changing national identities, borders, and citizenship are mitigated in part through the sex trafficking rhetoric. It is through the image of the dead woman's body, as Elizabeth Bronfen shows in her work on dead femininity and the aesthetics, that culture articulates its desire for immutability and that the threatened order is negotiated. The association of femininity and death, Bronfen suggests, is common in the repertoire of Wednesday culture and appears as a popular theme, especially in the literature and painting from the age of sensibility to the modern period. In the context of ongoing transformations, then, a dead feminine body, in a manner similar to that of the stereotype, works to secure a fantasy of the social order where differences between self, the other, West, and East are still in place. The instability and ambivalence that permeates cultural representation urges us to re-examine both the notions of the victim and agent, as well as the oppositional frame within which these operate. Much of the criticism feminist scholars, myself included, have advanced in relation to the figure of the victim of sex trafficking has focused on the stereotypical representation of femininity and the objectification of passive and violated women's bodies. These observations, while important, are however limited in their assumption of a separation between the mainstream representation of the victim, A, and the material lives-informed alternative image of women as agents, non-A. The work done in feminist and queer cinema studies offers insight into limits of this framing and suggests that such a juxtaposition between the two positions is untenable, inasmuch as the production of subjectivities are always intertwined with mainstream images. In her work of semiotics, Feminism and Cinema, De Laurentiis has illustrated how subjectivities are produced through the binding of fantasy and affect to mainstream image, and the ways in which this process directs the subject's desire, pleasure, and satisfaction. Consequently, this blurs the boundaries between the subject and the object of the gaze and brings attention to the multiple and contradictory instances through which subjectivities emerge and take shape. And to conclude, what I want to say is that against the tendency to deploy the narratives of migrant women in the sex industry as evidence of agency and hence straightforward challenge to the notion of victimhood, I suggest that we consider these narratives as instances of self-representation. It is useful to return here to Spivak's essay and her provocative affirmation that the subaltern cannot speak, through which she launches a representational challenge to empiricism. To engage in such a challenge is not to suggest that, inasmuch as their accounts are stories, migrant women's experiences in the sex industry do not matter, but that these accounts, in a manner similar to that of the figure of the trafficked women, are also a set of representations that cannot stand uninterrogated as a counter-truth. Hence, what I see as a way forward in this field of scholarship on topics around human trafficking is to work interdisciplinary by looking at materiality and representation and their interdependence, and with the aim of overcoming oppositional modes of thinking and move beyond agent and victims divide in both scholarship and activism. Thank you.
Thanks, Rutvica, for bringing on stage the iconic figure of the Eastern European sex slave and her counterpart, the evil male trafficker. For certainly this is a couple that we can easily imagine, see in front of us. Next to the Muslim extremist and his veiled and chained wife, and the African barbaric from the Congo and his female rape victim, they play a prominent and reassuring role in our daily standardized news diet. They are the main characters, already for some time now, in a genre of depoliticized moral tales of female suffering and male monstrosity, authorizing current forms of 21st century Orientalism. Now, there are many ways to address the question of why we see this iconic reanimation of the outsider female victim and the male monster. And in your paper, you trigger us to look beyond the current binary opposition between representations of migrant women in the sex sector as merely slaves, passive slaves, or at the other hand, as active migrants, political protagonists with agency. Instead, you argue to complexify things, a position and a fruitful one that I see taken by many of my colleagues, ethnographers in my own line of work in conflict studies, and particularly the micropolitics of violence and war. You make what I think a very strong case for the need to focus on process and on the ways in which migrant women navigate and negotiate representations of femininity and sex work, and how the constitution of subjectivity is always ambiguous and dynamic. And I think this role of complexifying the oversimplifications of our social world is an important task of the academic, and I can only very much support this effort. But, since there is some sort of a consensual tendency in these kinds of conferences on the post-colonial, I'd like to explore another direction. For merely complexifying simplifications is not enough. Rather than dismissing these simplifications, we have to put them center stage. We need to understand what makes them so persistent. Why do they resonate? How are they produced and distributed? How do they translate into institutional practices? And how do these practices play out in local settings? Aiming to repoliticize the stakes involved in what, again, Spivak calls epistemic violence, the violence of knowledge, and the role of the academic in the production of knowledge, we need to ask ourselves time and again the classic questions. Why do I see this portrayal of violence now? What kind of us-them divides are propagated? What forms of blame and accountability are implied? And how is this image politically functional? And more problematically, perhaps, what is not shown to us? Certainly, because the icon formation of the foreign female victim in need of rescue and the foreign male as the source of all evil is exemplary of a larger and fundamental shift in policy and media discourses on violence that I see in my field of studies, in conflict studies and war studies. It is exactly the revival of colonial fantasies in the 21st century which calls for scrutiny. What I see is, I see a move away from depicting actors in interstate war as strategic partners to dangerous bodies. During the Cold War, interstate violent conflict in what I would call the non-Western were mostly seen as proxy wars and explained in terms of ideological divides and superpower strategy. Largely, these local wars between the Contras and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, between the Mujahideen and the USSR loyalists in Afghanistan, were seen as hot but legitimate and supported with funding, arms, and patronage. Now, after the Cold War, these conflicts were coded as ethnic, particularly those in the Balkans. Ancient hatreds and primordialist identities were seen as root causes. Since the late 1990s, and increasingly, conflicts are framed as evil, driven by greed and terror. And of course, particularly after 9/11, this became the dominant policy framework through which wars were understood and dealt with. Rather than understanding such forms of violence as interconnected to the international system, they are portrayed as endemic and inherently local, given rise to a portrayal of parts of the global south as the borderlands, the badlands, the wastelands, and as dangerous social body. In an always unstable capitalist order with extreme and rising levels of wealth inequality and rapidly shrinking middle classes and feelings of endemic uncertainty, simplifications are highly attractive. They're socially meaningful, for they're reassuring, and they're politically functional, for they draw attention away from systemic accountabilities. They facilitate forgetfulness, and they are also extremely profitable. The widespread public fascination with images of war undoubtedly has something to do with the fact that depictions of warfare offer voyeuristic glimpses into theaters of violence that for most viewers are alien to their everyday experience. I think for many, portrayals of violence or threat seem to excite a strange, fearful, and yet persistent curiosity. Now, this tendency of us, audiences, to give heightened attention to violence is certainly not lost on those who make a living out of attracting viewer attention. From the first European picture magazines of the 1920s and 1930s to today's 24/7 corporate media, and from the Spanish War to the Iraqi War, high-impact images of violence, death, and destruction is what grabs viewer attention. It are, however, not only news organizations or the movie and video game industry that depend on the spectacularization of violence. The aid industry, the humanitarian industry, is equally driven by marketing concerns. Peace building as business depends on the marketization of violence. Neoliberal governmentality provides the backdrop, I think, against which to understand the way in which the aid industry is now forced to abide by the logic of the spectacle. Visual impact and a dramatic story, including a well-defined good and evil, and clear-cut perpetrators and victims have thus become a precondition for fundraising, advocacy, and charitainment efforts, and thus survival. In addition, the current international political order is no longer based on the sovereignty of states as the baseline of legitimacy, but on the judgment of conduct in relation to the realm of the human. This transfer of sovereignty from the local to the external as a structural transformation is reliant on a discourse of legitimation, rescue, and necessity. So increasingly, we see how intervention in distant lands has become represented as rescue of the innocent and feminine in the name of humanity, invading Afghanistan to rescue Afghani women. Women's mutilated bodies become symbols of local problems, justifying external solutions. Discourses of monstrosity and victimhood figure as powerful metaphors. And by localizing evil in the borderland, or in your case, the wild Balkan body, these representations work to obscure structural and global histories of violence, enforcing a neoliberal logic of blame and accountability. It is the story of Malala that is brought to us in great detail, not the impact and the aftermath of the drone attacks in the Swat Valley from where she originates. Evidently, I now am too complexifying things. And indeed, it is a complex number of industries that we rarely think of together that authorizes today's politics of portrayal. And we're certainly not going to get a full and clear picture of that this late afternoon. But I feel that particularly when it comes to the current politics of representation, these are crucial times. Global capitalism is moving its crises around. Audiences are presented with solutions and stories of blame and accountability, victims and perpetrators, good and evil. If our police forces and intel organizations eliminate the Balkan Mafia, we will bring an end to sex slavery. If the US military command AFRICOM catches rebel leader Joseph Kony, this will bring an end to child soldiering and economic underdevelopment in Uganda. If we stop mass rape in the DRC, the country will prosper. Now, in the words of David Harvey, crises are, as it were, the irrational rationalizers of an always unstable capitalism. During a crisis, such as the one that we're in now, it is always important to keep this fact in mind. We have always to ask, what is it that is being rationalized here? And what directions are the rationalizations taking? Since these are what will define not only our manner of exit from the crisis, but the future character of capitalism. At times of crisis, there are always options. Which one is chosen critically depends on the balance of power and the mental conceptions as to what might be possible. There was nothing inevitable about Roosevelt's New Deal and any more than the Reagan-Thatcher counter-revolution of the early 1980s was inevitable. But the possibilities are not infinite either. It is the task of analysis to uncover what might now be possible and to place it firmly in relation to what is likely given the current state of class and power relations throughout the world. And again, the politics of portrayal is of importance here. Our mental conceptions as to what might be possible and what not. So to conclude, I feel that in a lot of what is called humanities or cultural studies today, but also my own field of political anthropology, ethnographies of violence, we are too preoccupied with studying the form of the current discursive grammars, and we're busy refuting the simplifications of the social world instead of studying how these simplifications facilitate a politics of forgetting, a facility that enables the dislocation of the present, so that the attribution of responsibility is always located elsewhere, so that human costs of the current neoliberal order and the global military complex that sustains it are not considered as injurious or as complicit. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jolle. Rutvica, you have the chance to respond to Jolle, and then I'll open the floor for questions.
Thank you. Thank you for this. I think it's always really important and creative to have conversation with colleagues from different disciplines, because they just take a different perspective on your work and introduce something you have actually not been thinking about. And it's interesting that I have not been thinking about violence, and I was thinking as you were you were talking why I haven't engaged violence in the way you have spoken about it, especially as I have worked in international relations and politics, and I realized that the hesitation to do so, it's so much framed by the field and by the topic itself, because one of the key debates around sex work, as I have said before, is whether this is violence against women or not. And therefore there was a tendency from my side just to move away as quickly as possible from kind of discussing violence that I should have in a more detail. So I take that point. I think what interests me in this occasion is I have pushed this into humanities this time, is how the debate around human trafficking has actually, how the rhetoric of human trafficking has depoliticized the debate around migration and especially labor, and how this links. What I'm interested in is around issues of citizenship, and especially European citizenship in a post-'89 landscape. So how human trafficking has been kind of used to stabilize discursively to stabilize the changes that have been happening politically and socially in large Europe, and how this has happened through a very stereotypical set of representations. So it's what I'm really interested in this work is how do we link issues around representation to that of political landscape and actually instability of the European political landscape. And I think Europe is a really fascinating space to work on because of how fast changes are happening in the European enlargement process. If you think that some social groups that were imagined as victims maybe 10 years ago wouldn't classify as victims anymore in the field of sex work is quite fascinating. And this is very much linked with how much more to the east the border is moving. And just one quick point on why I insist on looking at representation and self-representation is my concern how this links to policy interventions and work of the NGOs, and I have been working in the NGO sector for a really long time, especially with different NGO groups. For example, when I spoke towards the end about complicating issues around whether one sees oneself as both victim and agent, is that very often what we find among NGO groups is that they would put in place programs for assistance of victims of trafficking. But then there would be much frustration among NGO workers, with women not really going with what they are proposing or they're suggesting. And there is a really important and I think crucial study that is coming from Norway that shows how Russian women in Norway actually, the tension happens because the women themselves don't see themselves as victims that need to be assisted or reintegrated by these programs, and therefore kind of exit programs with much of the frustrations of NGOs. So therefore, this is that how us thinking the overlap between agency and victimhood is actually really important for the very concrete works that is happening in the civil sector. And one of my aims has been to trying to convey that message and to enable people in that field, to give them tools to actually think about some of these issues in a more complex way.
I'd now like to give everybody the opportunity to ask questions or make comments. Anybody still on this late afternoon? Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Vron Ware. I really appreciated from both of you that attempt to connect sort of contemporary politics of migration and war and the question of representation. I suppose my question is really one that we struggle with all the time, is how do you counter representation in its particular forms? And so one question, one image that, Jolle, when you were talking was obviously Angelina Jolie with our dear Foreign Secretary, William Hague, which was really promoted, talking about the mass rape in Sierra Leone, and recently, which presumably you had here too, I don't know if you did, as a sort of international UN sort of intervention in rape, which fitted exactly with what you were saying about a sort of softening of attitudes towards forms of military intervention which are already taking place in sub-Saharan Africa and have been obviously ongoing for some time. But so I was thinking when Rutvica was talking about the development of a European, I mean, you look at the figure of the fallen woman looking back into the 20th century, but actually in contemporary cinema, what about films like The Silence of Lorna, you know, the Dardenne brothers film, which seemed to me to precisely complicate the kind of dichotomy that you're presenting of victim and, you know, of the victor or the image of the victim. So my other question that I wanted to ask you was, what about the position of Famine as a sort of radical, I can't really think at this time of the day, but sort of intervention in not being victims, in actually, but also presenting the body of the naked body of the female activist, sort of in your face. And one of the objects of one of their things that they're fighting against is pornography and the degradation of women, and how that fits into how their sort of political subjectivities that they're articulating from what we think of as Eastern Europe, how that complicates your picture that you've been presenting.
Wow. Famine. Thank you. May I take the first one?
Yeah.
The second one is huge. I've been thinking about it recently, exactly. Because they're Ukrainian, right? I think it's like the representation and the counter-representation, right? In a sense, what I tried to say in this paper and what I'm struggling with is really starting to kind of take a position that it's nearly impossible. It's like it's not effective to counter the position of the victim with that one of the agent. It can do a certain amount of work, but it cannot do other work. And I was thinking whether there is a way of, others have gone that route, and for example, there have been groups who work on anti-trafficking, and what they have decided to do is not use, in their counter-trafficking efforts, not to use women's bodies as kind of the main logo of their campaigns. And that would be one way of going about it. Another way of representation that I have found extremely interesting is the film Normal by Nicola Mai. I don't know if you have seen it. What he has done, he is an anthropologist who works in London, and he has done a film where he uses ethnographic interviews with women in the sex industry and with men who run the industry and women who run the industry. And then these stories are conveyed by the characters in his films. What is really interesting dynamic in the film, so there is 6 different characters that are both male, female, and transgender, is that he tells the audience before the beginning of the film that these are actors. But as you watch the film, you're so drawn into the narratives that of kind of victimhood and violence, that when you repeat at the end of the film that these are actors, and kind of audience becomes really aware that these are actors, there is always a very strong reaction from the audience, because they become very frustrated that they have participated in a certain type of voyeurism. So this would be kind of a different strategy of making people aware of how representation works. I think what I have tried to do very often is kind of move the debate from representation and counter-representation to that of bringing the state in, because I think if we get locked into representation and kind of victim and agents, very often what slips out of the debate is actually responsibility of the states. It's immigration policies, it's employment laws in creating and sustaining the conditions. So it is about really focusing attention on that. May I skip the one on famine, please? No, it's anyone else on famine? I think it's difficult because it's problematic in terms of the topics they take up and kind of how they intervene in other locations. And I was actually thinking recently, how do we link that to where they come from and what work they have done in Ukraine to question the political landscape there and gender politics. And I'm not aware of the work they have done in Ukraine itself.
Thank you. I think we have room for one last question. Anybody?
May I say something then?
Of course.
I think these 2 days have been really interesting for me, because there was a lot of complexifying and talking about slavery and kind of, let's call it historical slavery, that I find that is missing in debates on what last night has been called modern slavery. And I think that it would be really important to look at some of these links historically, and if they are links, and how some of these are rooted in history, how they are, with Rosie said, kind of played out in the present. So in a sense, when it comes to issues of modern slavery, I was thinking it would be so helpful if those of us working on contemporary slavery could recuperate some of the work and look more closely into some of the work you have been talking about in these 2 days, in terms of just to kind of challenge the whole notion of free labor against slave labor that is so predominant in the discussions about labor today, and maybe the role of the contract, because contract is seen as kind of tool of that kind of linked to the democracies, but actually a debate has been that in the historical studies have shown how contract has been a way of confining labor, and therefore it's kind of quite in opposition to what we see as free labor today. So in a sense, I think there is much work to be done, and I think this is a kind of a call for future exchanges, because the field of contemporary slavery I work on would profit much from the work that you have been doing and presenting in the last 2 days.
Thank you very much. Now, considering that apparently you've blown everybody away and answered all their questions, I think I would like to close this session. But not before I thank you on behalf of the Center for the Humanities and the organization of this conference for your talk and for your response. And as a token of appreciation, we have these small presents.